evening is why is the Prophet's birthday not celebrated in the place he was born, Saudi Arabia? For all three of you, if anybody feels like responding or everybody wants to respond.
I think you heard from the Prophet that there are some people who consider that to love Muhammad is bid'ah and shirk. And that's the mentality that you see prevailing in Saudi Arabia as far as the Salafi perspective is concerned. All these things are bid'ah, and therefore they do not believe in this concept.
Bismillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. With regards to the celebration of the birthday of the Prophet ﷺ, I don't think there's confusion about celebrating who he was through his sunnah, through his actions as to what he ﷺ embodied. As we know, the hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha, kana khuluqul Quran, with the Muslim perspective in mind. Muslim communities have differed as to how they're going to praise their beloved Prophet. And with the understanding, because when we're coming from different perspectives, when we're coming from different paradigms, is that we agree to disagree. No two people could have everything in common as far as 100% I agree with somebody else. And this is similarly the view and opinions of the scholars. And that is, some scholars disagree to celebrate the birthday of Prophet in that manner, where one specific day is celebrated in that perception of that day, being the birthday of the Prophet. And as far as the other scholars, what they consider is that the birthday of the Prophet is celebrated through the work and through the actions and through the sunnah of the Prophet every day. And this is the message. So we agree to disagree. That's okay. But I think the understanding is that what we have to look at bird's eye view, there's no disagreement about embodying the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. And I think that is the main focus and theme of the teachings of the Prophet. The Prophet didn't come so we could celebrate his birthday, but rather the Prophet came so we could emulate the way he lived his life.
One has to decide whether or not to say something controversial. And I was asked a similar related question by a journalist outside, and I was more hesitant to say it there than I'll say it now. Hamid Algar, in a remarkable book on Wahhabism, points out that prior to the Arabian Peninsula being ruled by Wahhabis, both Mecca and Medina were cities of great learning, where there were all different schools of thought, had learned teachers, where there were great libraries, where all the great Sufi tariqats had masters and sheikhs. And with the coming of Wahhabism as the ruling group in Saudi Arabia, unfortunately, Muslims who are not Wahhabis have been seen as kafirs. And that's wrong, because we should agree to see each other, to have the right to be able to express Islam and to follow the Prophet as we see fit in our conscience. But unfortunately, the Saudi regime does not allow that, and has not allowed that.
The next question is for Imam Faraz Khan. You mentioned that Muslims did not make people convert by the sword. However, there are some Muslim people in the world who argue that there is proof that Muslims have forced people to convert. What proof is there?
There are some people who think that the moon is made out of wax and the earth is flat. So what could we do about that? We can't do much. I mean, it's the way you think, and I think once a person has adopted a certain line of thinking, one could have a dialogue, one could have an understanding and proceed from there. But at the end of the day, Islam gives you the freedom to talk as you see fit, or to believe as you see fit. And if somebody believes in other than God, Islam gives you the freedom to express yourself and to practice that religion. Islam does not forces a person to live by the rules and regulations of the Quran. And there are many examples throughout the history of the Muslim world and Khilafah, and when Muslim conquered the Uthmani millet system, when they used to have the Armenians and the Greek and all the other Muslim millet or non-Muslim millet system, what they used to call that, they were allowed to freely practice their religion. And Islam allowed for that because there is an understanding that although we have a difference of opinion or a different understanding of what is the truth and how we deal with the truth and how we practice truth, there is an understanding and unity in knowing that we all belong to the same humanity. We all belong to the progeny of Adam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He talks about Adam, He says that He has karramna Adam, or Bani Adam, that we have honored the progeny of Adam. So we have honored, or we have put human beings in a position where we have raised them up high. And we have to understand that although people may disagree, it's okay. The understanding of the Muslims is you're allowed to disagree. The judgment that is final is in the hereafter.
Just one comment on this question. I think from the historical perspective, we have to differentiate two concepts. One is the conquest of the Muslim empire, and the other is the spread of the Islamic faith. These are two different things. When it comes to the issue of conquest of the Muslim empire, we do not deny that this was done by sword. But that does not automatically translate into converting people to the Islamic faith. And the example of the Ottoman Khilafat would be a very relevant one. You know, the Ottoman ruled Greece. If you look at Turkey and Greece, they are neighbors even now. And the Ottomans ruled over Greece for 500 years. And I have yet to see one Greek Muslim. At least I have not seen. and so that actually tells you that there is a difference on political domination of Muslim empires, which was done by sword, no doubt about it. We cannot run away from that fact. But that does not automatically mean that Muslims went around forcing their faith upon the people whom they conquered.
I'd just like to add one point to this, because it seldom gets said, and I think it should. Not only is this true, that we need to separate the conquest of Muslim empires from forced conversion, which was relatively rare in Islam. But what troubles me is that Muslims are always being asked, or are being told that they have to be judged by the worst behavior of Muslims. And Christians are always, asked to be judged by their ideals. The fact is that the Christian ideal was never forced conversion, but in Christian history, there were forced conversions of people who were seen as heretics. There were the killings of people who refused to convert. And when that is brought up, quite rightly, Christians say, but that's not our ideal, that's not how we should be judged. What I think is that Islam should be treated the same way. That we should be responsible for the actions of our community, and we should think about what we've done in our history where we have not lived up to our ideals, but just as Christians wish to have their ideals looked at, we should have our ideals looked at.
The next question is for Professor Vernon. What is the most exclusive thing you observed in Pakistan about the love of the Prophet?
Sorry, I cannot do that. Again, if I can be controversial, because I think that we can't run and hide from things. Because when we run and hide from things, then the people who want to spread hatred about Islam say, oh, they're just covering up. I remember talking to people about the things before I identified myself as a Muslim, the things that troubled me about Islam. And one of the things that troubled me about Islam was the incident of the Banu Qurayza, which some of you know, which was one of the few cases. And I am convinced that it did not happen the way Ibn Ishaq says it happened, because I cannot imagine the Prophet actually behaving in the way which is described there. And I remember talking to a very wonderful elderly woman who was a very close friend of mine there, who was talking a lot about Islam. And we were talking about this, and I said, well, one of the reasons I have not yet become a Muslim is I'm deeply troubled by the incident of the bottle crazy. And she looked at me and she smiled and said, Gordon Saul, my Prophet never did such a thing. And what I saw in the hearts of Muslims in Pakistan was this sense that people identified and saw in the Prophet what was there was not, people really didn't, at least the people I met, didn't think that much about qadr and naqla. What they thought about was the generosity of the Prophet and the patience of the Prophet, and the compassion and the love of the Prophet. And I saw that reflected over and over and over again. And that still rings in my ears whenever I think about the Prophet. Is that wonderful woman saying to me, "My Prophet never did such a thing."
The next question is for Brother Faraz Khan. You mentioned that the Quran never used the word. You mentioned in the Quran the word jihad was not used to define war or fighting, but the word qitr was used. If this is true, how did the word jihad become associated with a physical war?
The word qitr would be a fragrance that gives you a beautiful smell, but what the word qital and qatala as to fight, qatala, like the Arabic word qital, is the one that I referred to. And if you look back into the context of the ayat that were revealed, and just do a search, look up the word jihad. And all of them are talking about, there's a scholar, he gave a $1 million challenge to the Western media. And the challenge was to find the word jihad and show me in the Quran where God talks about, the revelation talks about fighting. Because that word isn't used for fighting in Quran. In the context of Quran, the word jihad is not used for fighting. The word that's used is qital, from qatala, to fight, to wage war. Or harb, that's the other word. Harb, haraba, which is to fight again. And these are different words that have been used. But what we hear about the jihad, that word, that connotation that goes along with it, that's where the confusion comes in. And that's what I was trying to say. So.
The next question is, for all three of you. Was the Prophet illiterate?
This is one of the most controversial issues about the Prophet. So, while there's a dispute among Muslim scholars on the concept of ummi, what does it mean? And I'll tell you that the way Quran uses the term ummi and ummiyin, there are different shades and meanings and context to that term. For example, there is one place where Quran describes Ahlul Kitab and ummiyin. The word ummiyin is used as opposed to those who are Ahlul Kitab. Ahlul Kitab means the people on whom a revelation had been sent down, as opposed to ummiyin, who had not received a revealed book before the Quran. And so when you look at the different contexts in which the word ummiyin has been used in the Quran, that's where you see the difference of opinion among the Muslim scholars. The Shia perspective, as far as the majority Shia scholars are concerned, they say that the Prophet definitely had the ability to read and write. Whether he wrote or read something, practically that's a different issue. But the ability was there because, we have this concept that the Prophet said, "Ana madinatul ilm wa Ali al-Babu." Ali didn't have any teacher other than the Prophet himself. Ali knew how to read and write, but you want to say that madinatul ilm, the Prophet himself didn't know how to read and write, and so that's a problem which is there all the time.
In regards to the question about was Prophet somebody who was literate, the term that Mulana Saab used rightfully so, about the Ummiyin and the concept of being an Ummi, being sometimes translated as illiterate. When it goes in the context of Ahlul Kitab, as the Maulana Sahib mentioned, this is the understanding that the people without a book. It doesn't mean the people. Maybe next time we'll start. Maybe next time we'll start mentioning people without the mic. But the concept of people without the book, Ummiyin, that's the idea. And I think.
Okay, the mic, please.
Bismillah.
Okay,
So it was the name of Allah. It would work. The concept of Ummiyin, again, as Maulana Sahib said, how he described perfectly and beautifully. Whether the Jamhurul Ulama, with regards to Sunni scholarship is concerned, there are scholars who say that the Prophet ﷺ knew how to read and write. But the majority of them, they would say he only knew few letters or so, like he was able to describe, or he was able to ask about when the Surah Al-Hudaybiyah was written. He asked Imam Ali radiallahu anhu, because he was the writer, about where is his name in the Sunni Ahadith that has been mentioned, where he has written Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim to erase that writing. So he asked the Prophet ﷺ, and the scholars use that as an indication that the Prophet ﷺ did not know how to read or write. Because the Meccans at that time, they asked that the document of the peace treaty of Hudaybiyah should start with Bismika Allahumma. How the Arabs used to write their documents, or how they used to start in the name of God or in the name of Allah, not Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, as the verses in the Quran start or we recite. So again, it goes both ways.
You have to mention about that here from Ummul Qura. This word from Ummul Qura means Meccan. That's another. Yes.
Well, I am not a scholar of the most ancient Arabic sources, but all I can say is that the people that I have studied with are in agreement. For them, Ummi meant unlettered and not illiterate. That most of the people that I have learned from had told me that the Prophet could read and write, but he was not, highly educated in a literal sort of way. And we all know that there are reasons why this becomes important in terms of documents, but there are disagreements. I tend to believe that the Prophet was able to read and write because he signed treaties.
You mentioned the Maqul Tatattu min Qabli min Kitab from the Surah Al-Kahf.
I think if I can just echo the Maulana Talmeen Sahib has just mentioned one more point about this issue, that Quran mentions in two places that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to the Prophet that you have been sent to warn al-Qura and the cities around it. al-Qura is mother of the cities, referring to Mecca and the cities around it. And so there are many scholars, especially Imam Raghib, who is an expert in Arabic language, where he says Ummi also refers to somebody who is from the city of al-Qura. So Ummi would also mean Makki, somebody who is from Mecca.
The last question for the evening is for the professor. How should the Western media, how can you inform the Western media that Prophet Muhammad did not bring terrorism but love and tolerance?
Well, I wish I could, because it's a huge, it is such a huge issue, and I'm in the process of trying to write a book, and maybe if I mention publicly that I'm trying to write it, I'll actually finish it. And the point of that book is much like what I was saying here, is that when you really look at the life of the Prophet, when you really look at the life and teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, when you really look at most of Islamic history, that the values of Islamic history are the values of human history, and that at the center of Islam is a humaneness and a value of human existence. The problem is we're being drowned out. We're being drowned out by Daniel Pipes, we're being drowned out by Robert Spencer, we're being drowned out by Glenn Beck, and I don't know. I wish that I did. I think that what we can do is we need to, I'm feeling quite, I am quite speechless at this. All we can do is every day, in our dealings with each other, in our dealings with other people, we have to make the case in our lives for who we are. I was asked by a journalist outside about, the Danish cartoons, and we know that this film Fitna has come out. And, I think part of it is that we have to find ways to respond to these insults that demonstrate the kind of sabr and the kind of forbearance and the kind of humility that will demonstrate to the rest of the world that we're not going to let a few, and in the case of the guy who made the film Fitna, fascist provocateurs make us lose our tempers and suck us into a fight where we'll simply be portrayed on Fox News as people who don't have humility and compassion. The more that, it bothers me a lot because, I tell this to the students in my class, we don't ask Italian Americans, what are you going to do about the mafia? Isn't it your job? But somehow we're responsible for Al-Qaeda. And as if Al-Qaeda is going to listen to me, or to you, or to you, and stop believing what they're believing. I think, well, I'll tell you one thing we can do. This just dawned on me, and I'm sorry if I'm a bit fuddled, but it's a big question. There was a time in this country where there was deep anti-Semitism, where Jewish immigrants were treated horribly, and were portrayed as people who had tails, as people who killed children, as people who lived greedily off the people who surrounded them, although most of them were poor immigrants who came to this country. What began to change that? Carl Reiner, Woody Allen, people writing the story of Jewish life in America in films, in novels, films like The Chosen, so that Gentile Americans who never met a Jewish person saw things and learned things about Jewish culture, so that now when Jon Stewart uses Yiddish and says, don't be a schmuck, everybody gets it. If I was to suggest anything to the younger generation of Muslims, write the story of your Muslim life in America. Make films about Muslim life that show Muslim humanity. Write short stories and novels that describe growing up Muslim, being Muslim in America. Only in terms of our religion and not in terms of our human life. And when Muslim life and culture and society become something that is seen by the rest of the world as something as human as us, when people start to get jokes about Ramadan, about families getting together for Korban Eid and the kind of stuff that happens with the families when they get together, when everybody begins to understand the humor of Islamic cultures in the same way they understand Jewish cultures, then it becomes more difficult to treat us as, well, not me, because no one sees me as Muslim. This is the thing that I always try to explain. I walk into Kmart, nobody thinks I'm a Muslim. I walk down the street, it's kind of hidden. I'm more concerned for my son, whose name is Mehmet Ali. What will that mean for him? And I think what we have to do is to portray ourselves in all of our complexity, in all of our diversity, in ways that show our humanity. And then it becomes almost impossible for the fascists and the Islamophobes to portray us as something other than we are. It's going to be a long fight, but I'm particularly speaking to the young brothers and sisters out there. Write those novels, write those screenplays, get them funded, portray your community the way it should be portrayed.
We were actually requested to ask one last question. If any of you can please recommend a book on the Prophet that you guys would recommend the younger generation read, the elder generation read. Any book you guys would read?
Well, I think I would recommend book written by a non-Muslim. I think among the contemporary writers on Islam and Muslims, the individual is very sympathetic to our faith, and even to the person, Prophet Muhammad himself, is Karen Armstrong. I would really, recommend her books. We might not agree about everything that she writes, but mostly whatever she writes is positive for Islam and for the Prophet.
A couple of scholars come to mind. One is not that old, contemporary people. I think for the younger generation, you may want to look into the Swiss author, Tariq Ramadan. Very eloquent, knows what's going on in the West, and also being a Muslim, I think he portrays the life of the Prophet in a very understandable way, relating it to the Muslims in the West. So there's an understanding that goes with it. Also, Martin Link, as far as relating the events of the seerah, Prophet, the life of the Prophet, Martin Link is also a good source to go back. The language is a little difficult, but I think for college students, you should not have any difficulty.
I didn't think when I wrote a syllabus for a class on contemporary voices in Islam, when I assigned the Tariq Ramadan book, that I would be as impressed with it as I was, not because I have anything against Tariq Ramadan, but because it's coming from this sort of modernist, very Sunni perspective. And for some of the Shia people in the audience, the way in which he, it's clearly written from a Sunni perspective, but if you pull back from that and simply look at what he's saying about the virtues of the Prophet, I think it's a really wonderful book. It's easy to understand, and I think that it's a great book to really raise questions and get people thinking in a positive way about Islam.